Government minister has said the only way to deal with British IS fighters in Syria is, in almost every case, to kill them. Rory Stewart, a Foreign Office minister, says converts to so-called Islamic State believed in an extremely hateful doctrine and had moved away from any allegiance to Britain.
I don't think anybody should be in any doubt. These are people who have essentially moved away from any kind of allegiance towards the British government. They are absolutely dedicated as members of the Islamic State towards the creation of a caliphate. They believe in an extremely hateful doctrine, which involves killing themselves, killing others, and trying to use violence and brutality to create an 8th century or 7th century state. So I'm afraid we have to be serious about the fact these people are a serious danger to us, and unfortunately the only way of dealing with them will be, in almost every case, to kill them.
Well, is that always the case, or should Brits who join through naivety be allowed to integrate back at home? Christiane Boudreau's son was killed 3 years ago after travelling to Syria to fight IS. We can speak to her now, along with Conservative MP Colonel Bob Stewart, who sits on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Thank you both for taking the time to speak with us today. Christiane, what do you make of these comments in light of what your family has been through?
They're very uneducated, dangerous, blanket, generalized statements. By putting out statements at that level of violence and generalizing it over everybody who's joined these organizations without the individuality of each case, you're also creating hypocrisy and confusion in youth in wondering who's the worst, the more evil of the two groups, government or these extremist groups, by stating, just kill them all, you're just as bad as they are.
Colonel Bob Stewart, speak to Christiane.
Well, can I ask you whether you knew your son was going out to the Middle East, and if you did you try and stop him?
I absolutely had no idea he was going out to the Middle East. It was in 2012, and my government unfortunately decided it was not up to me to try to stop him, so it didn't inform me of the information that they'd had all this time.
Was he fighting against us when he was killed?
When he went over with Jabhat al-Nusra initially, and eventually changed over to IS in the beginnings of IS. He was fighting against Bashar al-Assad for what he thought was the right thing to do because of all the torture on the women and children that nobody else was doing anything about. In his mind, that's the reason he went. It wasn't about brutality or killing everybody or anything else. And there are a lot of youth over there, children, women, that are there for different reasons that aren't necessarily there to kill everybody in sight just because that's what they must do.
Did he communicate back to you when he was there and tell you this?
Absolutely. We communicated on a regular basis on the telephone, right up until he changed over to IS, and then communications became strained.
So he realized that IS was an enemy of this country?
He didn't say any statement along those lines. Not once did he say they were an enemy of anybody, and nor am I defending their actions. I'm not defending anybody's actions when it comes to violence. I'm just saying, basically, to make a broad statement, uneducated, and creating even more danger at those youth that are sitting on the fence without reaching out, by creating an environment of hostility on both sides, makes it very difficult for the youth to decide who's right and who's wrong.
Well, unfortunately, they've got off the fence. They've gone and they're fighting, and they're killing people by their actions. This is a real problem. Our problem is, if we allow such people back, can we trust them? I mean, I have actually been on the ground on operations and seen this. They change.
I agree. There's a lot of things there, but we let them go. We let this happen. Our communities, we are failing our communities and are failing our youth. Until we start making some changes ourselves, and the way that we start integrating programs for youth and giving them a voice where they can be heard and stop dealing with everything with such hypocrisy, how can they make those informed decisions properly and educated, especially when our representatives of our government are making uneducated statements themselves and generalizing? Is just proving their point. So you're aiding these extremists in their arguments by saying these statements. I'm not saying anything is right or wrong in this case.
Christiane, forgive me for jumping in, but tell me, if your son hadn't been killed fighting for Islamic State and he decided that he wanted to return home, do you feel he would have been safe to return home, or do you feel that he would have posed a threat to society?
Very difficult to say. I mean, unless you sit down with each individual as to where they're at in their own ideological process. We've heard of many youth that get over there, that realize it's not what they expected. They want to escape, but they're not allowed to. They'd be executed. There's so many other conditions that we don't necessarily understand for each case. I would expect him to go straight into prison, absolutely, without a doubt. There would need to be some assessments and everything else. In this case, we also have to look at women and children that are there, that were brought unwillingly, that were forced. Some of the young children at this point have been indoctrinated, but does that mean that we don't give them a chance again? They're 10, 11 years old. Do we create that blanket statement for them as well? They could be dangerous too. But unless we reach out and try to help them, how can we know?
Colonel Bob Stewart, respond to that point.
Well, the problem is, I've seen evidence personally in Africa, for example, in northern Uganda, of children that have been taken by the Lord's Liberation Army, brainwashed, and then they come back saying all is well, they go back to their families, and then they turn guns on them. I mean, I'm sorry, but we have got to be extremely careful. When someone deliberately goes against his background here or her background here and says, well, you know, this is awful, I'm going to a much better place. They go to the much better place and they pick up arms against us. I'm afraid we ought to look at that and say, frankly, I don't trust this person and I'm not sure I want them back in my society.
I agree that we have to be cautious. Without a doubt, we have to be cautious. It's not like we are just going to let them in and say, here, live your life, pick up where you left off. Hopefully we are intelligent enough to be able to sit with them and determine, are we saying that we don't have that level of intelligence and education to deal with the problem appropriately? I just don't.
We've got a problem because how many people did your son kill?
Okay.
Do you know how many people your son killed, or was he involved in that?
Have no idea, quite honestly.
Well, there we are.
I begin to tell you.
I mean, I have to say, I'm extremely cautious about allowing people back into our society who've rejected us absolutely. And frankly, we've got good evidence of them going against and killing women and children in our own country. So why the heck should we take such a risk?
I agree that we should be cautious. But again, that blanket statement, by stating that we're going to fight violence with violence and killing is okay, how can you turn around and say to the violent extremists that killing's not okay? It doesn't matter that we're a member of a government or a community, or it doesn't make it easy for youth to distinguish right from wrong when we're making the same statements but saying it's okay for us to do it, but not them. And that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying here is that we have to be very cautious about our rhetoric. We have to be very cautious about what we're putting out there in the public and how it's being viewed and seen. By making those types of statements is very dangerous and can push those youth that are still at home, sitting down, not sure about what direction, what path they're taking. That can be a motivational push to take the choice of that extremist view. And that's what these types of statements, uneducated statements, dangerous statements,
they're not
can
uneducated.
do.
Colonel Bob Stewart, can I ask you, if there are naive, vulnerable people who went over to join so-called Islamic State, who arrived, realised it's not what they wanted to come home, why can't they come home and be put in prison? Why is it that the British government is suggesting, a country where we don't have the death penalty, that it's okay to kill these fighters?
I think Rory was probably referring to people that are still fighting. That's the way I would interpret that. If you are still fighting, you are actually in a combat situation. I don't think that he was actually referring to people that got out. We've got to deal with them in a civilized way. We don't have the death penalty. They shouldn't be shot on sight, of course not. But frankly, we should deal with people that get back to this country. And frankly, as they've rejected us, please stay there. But if they get back to this country, we've got to deal with them in accordance with our laws and as humanely as possible. But I don't like them coming back. I prefer them to stay because I don't trust them.
There are a lot of people in society that we don't trust, and there is a lot of violence, and not necessarily just in these extremist ideological views. We see that on a daily basis. We can't start saying we just don't trust everybody, because that creates division.
We don't say we don't trust everybody. We don't trust people that have gone to fight for IS.
Strength and unity.
So
we don't trust. This is not happening, so they're not making these choices. We need to start supporting people that have mental health issues. We need to start providing that, which we are no longer doing. And that's creating more of a problem.
You're broadening out the subject. I'm sad that your boy's been killed. I'm very sad about that. I wish he hadn't been. But he was fighting for IS, and IS are an enemy of this country.
Thank you both.
I accept that. He put himself in the position, yeah.
Christiane, thank you both for joining us. Thank you also, Colonel Bob Stewart.